The newsagents.
If you want to really see something that's said, take a look at what happened.
The nightmare moment in Pennsylvania when a volley of shots ring out, one bullet grazing the president's ear, an attempted assassination of the Republican presidential candidate with repercussions that go far and wide beyond the venue where that rally was taking place.
This is all taking place on the eve of the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, in Wisconsin, where Donald Trump will again, for the third time, be anointed the Republican presidential candidate. And it will do so with the shadow of political violence looming larger and longer than it has done in the United States since the 1970s. What does it mean for the race for Trump, and what happens now? Welcome to the newsagents.
The newsagents.
It's Jon.
It's Lewis.
And the image is going to go down the ages in America. It is going to be seared upon the nation's consciousness. It is going to ricochet around the world. It already has done. Of Donald Trump, face blooded, surrounded by Secret Service agents who are acting as the bodyguards, literally putting the body between the person they're guarding, while Donald Trump, blood on his face, is mouthing the words, fight, fight, fight. Bloodied but unbowed, defiant, determined. These are powerful images that will have a bearing on what happens in November.
And there are other images as well that are astonishing, not least a picture which apparently shows the literal bullet which was an inch away from killing the 45th president of the United States, closer than any assassin has got to killing a president or former president since the attack on Ronald Reagan in the early 1980s. And what it showed is, and there's still so many details to come and we can't speculate too much about it. We know that the attacker was killed. The name has been released, but we don't know too much else about him yet. All of that will come in the next few days. But what we can absolutely say is that Donald Trump, even in that moment, reminds us what a formidable political candidate he is, because his political instincts were still, even at that moment, and I don't think it's indelicate to say it, still absolutely as sharp as they've ever been. He knew, I think, what that picture would look like, and he knew in saying fight, fight, fight in the way that he did, he knew how that would be interpreted. He remains an astounding political figure in almost every way.
So there are a number of things to consider, which we'll try and do on this sort of emergency episode. I mean, one is the security failure, because it is absolutely a security failure that someone with a rifle could get so close to the president in this day and age when the security at these rallies is enormous.
I mean, it is amazing that, isn't it? I mean, you've been to Hampton more than most people have had hot dinners. I mean, the security at these things is astounding, and it is again, we don't want to speculate too much, but it does seem like there has been some sort of lapse.
So the cordon around an area where Trump speaks at a rally is huge. I mean, huge, wide, with fencing all the way around that you cannot access the site. Anyone who wants to get in to get an access point will have to go show their credentials, that they have credentialed to go to this rally, and then they will go through airline style security, where you will go through a metal detector, you'll be wanded, and your bags will go through a check. And if, when I was there with film crews, that would take a long time because everything had to be checked thoroughly, and then you would get into the area. But even on surrounding buildings, the US Secret Service has enormous power of discretion over whether a building is closed or open, or whether the Secret Service of controlling access points. It looks like this guy managed to get onto a roof of a nearby warehouse, and he was very visible. I've heard eyewitnesses saying, I could see a guy climbing onto a roof with a rifle. And as you say, Lewis, 1 or 2 inches and it would have been a very different story that we would be talking about today.
Yeah, and obviously not the only example of political violence, or just gun violence, obviously, in the United States, full stop. And of course, Donald Trump and many of the people in that room are some of the most fervent defenders of Second Amendment rights, which is the right to bear arms. And we know how present all violence is in America, and it's come home to the Republican Party in these events. But obviously, as tragic as this is and as awful as it is, and messages of concern have been issued from all across the world, political leaders, including Keir Starmer here and so on, and President Biden. They had Trump and Biden, not long after the attempted assassination, had a phone conversation, which is very unusual, right? They very rarely
And
interact.
positive.
And positive, yes, it is. But yes, indeed so. But obviously, it is hard not to consider the political implications, because there will be political implications of this. And one of them, to state the obvious in a way, is that Trump's own standing within the Republican Party, which is already thick and dense and deep, will become even stronger and even more formidable. You've seen people respond to this, Trump allies, but not just Trump allies as well, talking about how, even talking about him in terms of martyrdom, right? Talking about him being saved by God, talking about him being saved by Jesus Christ. Marco Rubio, who's one of a former enemy of Trump's, but is now one of the leading contenders to become the vice presidential nominee, said exactly that he had been saved by God overnight. And when you consider how important the evangelical element is to the Republican Party and to Trump's personal coalition as well, that's not an accident, and it's not immaterial.
We now have two iconic images of Donald Trump from this presidential election campaign. The first is the mugshot taken at Fulton County Prison, I think it was, in Georgia, where he'd gone over this kind of phone call where he was charged for kind of election interference over a phone call to the Secretary of State in Georgia saying, "Find me more votes." And that mugshot kind of spawned T-shirts and mugs and all the rest of it, and helped Trump raise a whole ton of money. So we've got the mugshot picture, which also seemed to symbolise, for a lot of Donald Trump supporters, his oppression, the torture, the deep state acting against him, the deep state trying to load the dice in their favour in the election so that Biden would win by this kind of unfair use of the justice system to persecute him. And now we have got this other image, even more iconic, of the bloodied face, defiant, and as you say, Lewis, every political instinct still twitching brightly in Donald Trump as he instinctively realised and recognised the value of the images that would go out from that rally site in Pennsylvania. But it's worth listening as well, because you mentioned Joe Biden, to what Joe Biden had to say afterwards when he addressed the nation following this assassination attempt.
I have tried to get a hold of Donald. He's with his doctors. Apparently he's doing well. I plan on talking to them shortly, I hope. There's no place in America for this kind of violence. It's sick. It's sick. It's one of the reasons why we have to unite this country. We cannot allow for this to be happening. We cannot be like this. We cannot condone this. And I want to thank the Secret Service and all the agencies, including the state agencies, that have been engaged in making sure that the people who, and we have more detail to come, the idea that there's political violence or violence in America like this is just unheard of. It's just not appropriate. And everybody must condemn it. Everybody.
Yeah, and I wonder, in a weird way, if Biden, in terms of talking about the political implications, I think there is a case that in the short term at least, don't know about the presidential election in November, because this could buttress Trump for that, but in the short term at least, I wonder whether Biden and the benefits, in the sense that the question around his candidacy for the Democratic Party, which has obviously been dominating American politics for the last week, for the last 2 weeks or so, ever since that terrible, catastrophic debate that Biden had, it seems to me that the air potentially goes out of that debate, at least for the next few days, because everything is going to be consumed about not only what happened, how it happened, the Secret Service, but also how Trump responds and how he reacts and how it influences the Republican National Convention. And as we know, if the Democrats were serious about having a new candidate or having a candidate who is not Biden They really don't have much time to do it because their own convention and the processes which nominate Biden for that are just around the corner.
Yeah, I mean, there was something that Biden said that really struck me when he said it's just unthinkable, or kind of this sort of thing doesn't happen in America. Well, I'm afraid, sadly, if you look at America's history from, Abe Lincoln onwards, there is a history of extreme political violence, 4 presidents assassinated. This is the latest assassination attempt. There have been a number of congressmen, most recently the deputy speaker in the House, Steve Scalise, who was shot very badly. Gabby Giffords, another lawmaker, a Democrat lawmaker this time, who was shot by a gun enthusiast.
Nancy
Pelosi's husband was attacked. It goes on and on and on. And in an era where you have got extreme polarization and the toxification of American politics, you need moves now to surely try to diffuse things, to calm things. I mean, I would have thought it would be in Donald Trump's best interest. I think it would be a brilliant campaign move now to issue a call for calm, for respect. Let this be settled at the ballot box. I think it would reach out across the aisle and help him demographically with those groups that have still been resistant to going towards Donald Trump.
I think it would be extremely smart and also the right thing to do, fundamentally, but I think politically as well. I think so much now depends in terms of what happens to American politics, which, let's be honest, it feels like it's a tinderbox. It feels as if we are only a few steps away from something really unravelling. And political violence, as you say, John, it's always been part of the American experience, of the American political experience. It's always been present in the history of the American Republic. And it's ebbed and flowed and waxed and waned and been worse at different times than others. The period of time where it reached its most recent apogee would be the 1960s with the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King. And I think we forget now, who didn't live through it, we forget how existential I think many people felt it was at that time, how dark it felt, how this, and after Kennedy's assassination, that the genie had been let out of the bottle and wasn't going to go away. And there was the danger that descent begins again. And so much now depends exactly on how Trump personally responds. Because if Trump comes out and does what is already the murmurs around from his supporters and from some of the MAGA crowd, and hints at, adverts to the idea that this is some sort of deep state attack, that this is as a result of his political enemies, that Biden is somehow involved, then things could get very ugly very, very quickly. And the tenor of this election, which has already felt like an inflection point and already felt, we all know, that there could be violence, that becomes so much more likely, so much more worrying. And the long run up to that election, 120 days or so, becomes even more arduous.
Look, the word fight can be a metaphor. You talk it in all walks of life. We've got to fight if we want to win this game. We've got to fight if we want to do this. It can also be seen as an injunction. It can also be seen as an instruction. So when Donald Trump at the Ellipse on the 6th of January, talking about fighting like hell to save our country, as he did, and inviting people to come to Washington because it is going to be wild, a lot of people took that as an injunction, an exhortation to do what they needed to do. And you saw the Proud Boys and you saw the Oath Keepers taking up a paramilitary stance with a command structure where people would assault the Capitol and prevent the peaceful transfer of power and the certification of Joe Biden's victory.
Hanging the vice president.
And with the calls to, hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence. And you've got to be very, very careful that America doesn't start going down that dark road, which leads to a very bad place. It's so funny, having lived in America, where two things go hand in hand. You have the almost commonplace nature of political violence and some of the brutality around it, with all the talk of American exceptionalism, about America being the shining city on the hill, how these founding fathers started with a blank sheet of paper and created this near perfect democracy. And there is something very imperfect. And unless America takes the right steps now, why American will seem exceptional will be for all the wrong reasons. That is serious. And it's serious for us. It is serious if the shooter, by missing Donald Trump's head by 2 inches, has guaranteed his victory. Look at the consequences that can flow from a Trump victory in terms of, the shape that Europe takes, NATO, Ukraine, you name it. There are all sorts of things that could flow from it. And so political violence just brings instability. It doesn't bring certainty.
No, it doesn't. I mean, it's worth actually, so just in terms of the narrower question, well, it's not a narrow question, but the question of kind of how this might affect the presidential election. I thought Frank Luntz actually said, the American pollster actually said something really interesting about it. And he said that in the end, voters will settle down and return to their candidate of choice. The people who move towards Trump out of sympathy will probably move back. But what happened in Pennsylvania will definitely affect the final vote in that it guarantees every Trump voter will actually vote. Biden or any other candidate the Democrats pull up won't have the same participation certainty, and that participation gap is worth at least 1% and as much as 2%. And because it happened in Pennsylvania, the impact will be tightest in Pennsylvania, or highest in Pennsylvania. And of course, Pennsylvania is an absolutely crucial swing state. And he compares it with what happened with George Floyd in 2020, which was a similar act, you could argue, of political violence, or certainly of violence. And it buttressed the Democratic coalition because it enthused them. And there is the possibility that the Republicans, who are already more enthused in this election anyway, in whatever way, however Trump reacts, even if he says nothing about it, are enthused by these events.
And just going back to an earlier point that we kind of touched on but didn't really analyse, which is the impact this has on Joe Biden. For the past week on this podcast, we have been talking about how Joe Biden's candidacy is nearly fatally compromised by his age, by the debate performance, by the questions over whether his mental acuity is there or not, whether he would be able to withstand the rigours of 4 more years in office. All those questions were looming large. And we were saying, and I think rightly, that if the Democrats are going to change who their candidate is for the presidency, by God, you've got to do it now, because you haven't got a lot of time. And the time is of the absolute essence. And if he's going to be forced out of the race, as there were moves to do before this, they've been halted. No one's going to be talking about his age now. It is going to be about the lessons of this, about Trump's health, what Trump does. It's not going to be about Joe Biden's age. Joe Biden has won breathing space, which I think means it now looks more or less certain that Biden will remain the Democrat nominee come November, with all the problems associated with that.
I think, to go back to what you were just saying, and I think it is important to say this about kind of the tenor of American politics and Trump's role in that. Look, I mean, and you have to sort of, because whenever you try and make a nuanced point about this, people take it out of context. So to be absolutely clear, there can be no justification for political violence against anybody, and that includes Trump. And it was heinous and it was appalling, and it came so close to killing him, and who knows what the implications of that could have been, and his family will be appalled, and et cetera, et cetera. There can nonetheless be no denying that if we're talking about the caustic nature of American politics, of how toxic it's become, how polarised it's become, how much the spectre of political violence is looming so long now, Trump clearly has a role in accelerating that. He's not the only cause of it. He's a symptom as much as a cause, and it predates him. But he is a big part of it. And we saw that. I mean, if we just take one example, in terms of what happened with the 2020 presidential election, never mind what happened with January 6th, even though that's connected to it, in refusing to accept the outcome of an election. But let's remember, he's refused always to accept any election outcome where he didn't win. He implanted into the DNA of American democracy the seed of violence. Because as soon as you have a leading presidential candidate, the leader of a party, say that an election has been stolen, in saying that there was a coup when there wasn't, of course, millions of people will respond to that in the most toxic way possible. And that is not to mention as well, of course, all of the times in which Trump himself has undermined when there has been violence against other people. So, for example, he was extremely dismissive and basically made fun of the attack that took place on Paul Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi's husband, which would have attacked her if she had been there. He was very dismissive about the kidnap attempt plot against Gretchen Whitmer, the Democrat governor of Michigan. There have been many occasions like that. Now, that's not to say that other people, and people have been pointing to Joe Biden talking about putting a bullseye on Trump's back in the last week or so. It's not to say that other politicians aren't also guilty of extremely high-octane, aggressive statements. But if we're talking about the slow, inexorable path towards aggression that American politics has taken in recent years, if we're talking about how that is intimately connected with democratic backsliding and the disintegration of democratic norms, all roads in the end, or many roads at least, do lead back to Donald Trump.
Look, I think one of the most troubling aspects of this period since January the 6th, 2021, is the extent to which Donald Trump has still issued and reissued those lies, magnified them with more falsehoods. And after October the 7th in Israel, he started a new line in his speeches, which was about freeing the hostages. And freeing the hostages, he wasn't talking about those that were taken by Hamas, although he would want that to happen. He was talking about the hostages, inverted commas, that are in prison now for taking part in the January the 6th riot. No, the people who are in prison were found guilty by courts of law where there were 12 members of the jury who found them guilty or innocent, and in a lot of cases guilty, and that is why they are in prison. They're not hostages. But Donald Trump is undermining, or has undermined, so many pillars of American democracy, and in particular the justice system, whether it be the Department of Justice and the prosecutions that were brought, whether it be the FBI, which some of his supporters say should be disbanded because it's an agency apparently of Joe Biden and not an independent law enforcement agency. And so it goes on. And you could just see the way that Trump treated the court and the judge in New York over the hush money payments. Everywhere there has been a systematic undermining, and there are huge numbers of his supporters who believe the FBI are rotten, the justice system is rotten, and only Donald Trump speaks the truth about the state of America. And that is potentially dangerous when he then says, fight.
And if this reminds us one thing as well, is it is a reminder to us in Europe about how high the stakes are for this election and how quickly and how seriously we might need to take our own security, in the sense that it's a reminder that there was a lot of talk over the last 20 years about the decline of American power. You know, the rise of China, the rise of Asia, all of this sort of stuff. The idea it would be the Chinese century and everything. In so many ways, so many of those predictions have proved to be untrue. The American economy remains extremely dynamic. It remains the largest in the world. The ability of America to project military power remains unmatched by any competitor. The threat to American power and hegemony, and therefore Western security, isn't from American external power.
No.
It's from its internal political problems. And you can see with this election, when American presidential elections become inflection points, which either lead to paralysis or worse, violence, it then therefore becomes impossible for America to retain its role as either the world's policeman or certainly the guarantor of Western security, or at least it becomes much, much harder. And we might need to prepare ourselves for a future where America's internal political problems are so profound that it basically prevents them from having and executing that role that we've relied upon them for decades and decades and decades. And that we need to start grappling with that in Europe in a way that I still don't feel, despite all of the warning signs, we're doing in any way.
Well, you just take a slightly longer view and zoom out a bit on that. I mean, after 9/11 in 2001, the whole focus of American national security was the threat from without, the threat that al-Qaeda terrorists could come and bomb American mainland in a way that hadn't been seen since Pearl Harbor, that brought America into the Second World War. That was the threat. The threat was of outside terrorist groups who might want to wage their terrorist campaigns on American soil. And the whole focus of the national security apparatus in America, which is considerable, was on that threat. And after January the 6th, 2021, the threat became the threat from within, and that we could tear ourselves apart as a country. And that threat is still very much alive and kicking, as we have seen from events in Pennsylvania in the past 24 hours. Thank God the assassin failed. But his death, his shooting dead by the Secret Service, which you can completely understand, means that we'll never fully know why he did what he did. And when that happens, just like with Lee Harvey Oswald and his being killed after he was arrested, and after the assassination of JFK, that spawns conspiracy theories about what was really going on, who knew what, where he was placed, who allowed it to happen, why didn't the police intervene. All of that is going to be fertile soil in which more conspiracies grow, in which more distrust grows, and that's the last bloody thing America needs right now.
You might be wondering where Emily is and think that she might have a fair bit to say on this, and indeed you would be right. But the reason she is not here is because she is already on her way to Wisconsin to Milwaukee to cover the Republican National Convention for the newsagents for us over the course of the next week. Before she hot-footed onto the plane, though, she did send us her thoughts on what's happened overnight.
This is Emily, and I'm heading to Milwaukee right now, where the Republican convention begins tomorrow with, I guess, a bloody but unbowed Donald Trump centre stage, because this attempt on his life, from what we can see, will change everything. This will start to become the stuff of legend and fairy tale and hero and inevitably conspiracy, as people try and work out what on earth went on in those fateful seconds just inches away from Donald Trump on stage in Pennsylvania last night.
So we'll obviously be hearing a lot more from Emily throughout the week on the newsagents and the newsagents USA. So please stay with us, because obviously now it was always going to be an important week. Now it is extraordinary, the implications of what happened.
Like no convention.
Has happened before. I mean, an attempted assassination of the Republican candidate days before his convention. It's just, you can't find the precedent for that. I mean, just before we go, it seems that what has happened overnight in political terms is that it is now almost certain that it is Donald Trump versus Joe Biden in November, when a lot of people might argue that America would be better served by it neither being Biden nor Trump fighting the election in November. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.